Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Managing Vendor Issues and Challenges at Your Credit Union webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Questions, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will answer some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 polling questions that appear on your screen during today's presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We'll send the link to the follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session. If you meet all requirements, we'll send your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Kelly Vick, VendMinder's president. Today, Kelly will discuss preparing and handling any vendor issues that may arise and provide valuable tips for resolving these challenges. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our Managing Issues in Your Third-Party Risk Management Program, the Complete Strategy ebook, the Third-Party Risk Management Lifecycle Toolkit, 3 Ways to Measure Vendor Performance infographic, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Kelly. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jessie. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the agenda for today's session. First, we're going to actually talk through a definition of vendor issues and then move on to why it's important to manage them. Then we'll take a look at the third-party risk management lifecycle and where you would likely find issues falling within it. And of course, we need to talk about what to do with these issues and talk about some tips to solving them and the challenges with some issues. And then, of course, we'll end with some key takeaways as we always do. So let's just jump right in. So again, let's start by actually defining a vendor issue. So looking first at Webster's definition for issue is an important topic or problem for debate or discussion. When we apply that to third-party risk management, a vendor issue is any unexpected result or scenario, a problem, that requires more evaluation, debate, and discussion, and likely some actions to mitigate any risk that may accompany the issue. Issue management is actually having a defined process around that. You can identify these issues, you can address the issues, and resolve these issues. Again, these are those unexpected situations that occur with your vendors, and I'm here to tell you every vendor will have some issues associated with them. Regardless of how good that vendor relationship is or how thoroughly you vetted them or how mature your third-party risk management program is, as I just said, you will encounter unexpected situations with some of your vendors along the way, maybe even all of your vendors. Doesn't mean they're going to be severe issues, but there are issues nonetheless that you will want to monitor along the way for each of your vendors. Okay, so let's start talking about why issue management is so important. On this slide, you'll see there's 5 reasons, and we're going to cover each of these reasons in a little more detail on the following slides. I'll just quickly list them. It's a regulatory expectation. It prevents reputational harm from vendor actions. It supports risk mitigation. It remediates contractual discrepancies, and it protects your financial health. So let's keep going, and we'll talk about each one of these in more detail. So again, first and foremost, it's a regulatory expectation. Regulators in your industry, especially in the financial services area, are expecting credit unions to manage vendor risk, and that includes a process for managing and escalating issues. So if you go look into all of your regulatory guidance, you will find this talked about throughout that regulatory guidance. Secondly, again, it prevents reputational harm from vendor actions. Vendor issues that are not properly managed can escalate to larger problems. And likely, continued vendor issues can reflect really poorly on your credit union and can reflect a very poorly managed vendor and one that maybe you want to reconsider when that time comes. Again, as I mentioned, it supports risk mitigation. So certain vendor issues can also elevate maybe other risk areas like cybersecurity or operational risk. Like I just mentioned, if these issues keep popping up, maybe it's an indication that there are just poor management practices across that vendor. But especially when they involve your critical or high-risk vendors, and issue management helps mitigate these risks and protects your credit union and your members. So it definitely is something that if used properly and managed properly will allow you to get control of the of mitigating the risk that you could possibly experience. And then continuing on, again, it remediates contractual discrepancies. So issue management provides, documented evidence when the vendor fails to meet contractual obligations, maybe such as service level agreements. And we'll talk about service level agreements being, a very common item that is monitored as an issue. But the evidence can then be used to renegotiate the contract for better terms or maybe initiate even an early termination if you have more issues that creep up with that vendor. Again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, which could indicate bigger problems to come if you continue to have issues creep up. So it remediates helps remediate contractual discrepancies. And then lastly, it protects your financial health. Resolving these vendor issues consistently and timely can help avoid any negative financial impact, maybe from some unplanned expenses where, I don't know, maybe you had to put some controls in place because the vendor wasn't doing their job. Possibly you have some regulatory fines because of some issues with that vendor, maybe even litigation, maybe even lost revenue from dissatisfied members. So managing through issues with your vendor and being on top of them certainly will protect your financial health. So the bottom line is the proper management of issues is crucial or critical for safeguarding you, your employees, and your members from these negative impacts and situations of these vendor issues. So let's take just a quick minute and be sure we understand the difference between an issue and a risk. An issue refers to something that we know is an issue. It's present. It is currently happening. A risk, on the other hand, is something that could happen. It's a potential problem that may or may not arise. But it's important to understand the difference as you're managing your vendors through the life cycle. So let's just look at a couple of examples. A risk is that member data could be compromised. An issue is, however, that there is a known cybersecurity breach that has happened with that vendor. Another example is a risk exists that member-facing vendors can impact your member satisfaction. If they're not providing good service, they can impact it negatively. An issue, on the other hand, is you have member complaints that are rising on a specific vendor, indicating an issue. And lastly, another example of a risk is unplanned downtime that can negatively impact your members. Whereas when the system has a prolonged or unplanned outage, that is an actual issue. It has actually happened. So again, an issue is something that is currently present, whereas a risk could be a potential problem that may or may not ever happen. So looking at the third-party risk management life cycle, where do issues live? Well, technically, they live anywhere and everywhere on this life cycle. An issue, again, is something that needs to be debated or discussed. It doesn't necessarily mean it's critical, although it could be, or it could reach criticality. But you could find them when you're vetting the vendor. You could find them during ongoing monitoring of that vendor, or you could find them when you are deciding to exit with that vendor. So really the message here is that vendor issues exist. The key is to have an issue management process in place to be able to identify them and manage and monitor them and resolve them regardless of where they surface in the life cycle. So let's just take that a step further and take a look at some typical issues that could occur across the life cycle. So in onboarding, it could be that you have missing or insufficient due diligence documentation from the vendor, or maybe it revealed some insufficient controls. Possibly there is a single point of failure in this vendor, or maybe they had some poor testing results you're not happy with. On an ongoing basis, now you've signed the vendor, you're using the vendor, they're in place, maybe some things that occur is some new or evolving risks that didn't exist when you brought that vendor on. Here's another one that is likely to occur during ongoing, and that is a change of key personnel or management. Maybe you're getting outdated or expired due diligence documents. Maybe they're refusing to provide updated documents. Maybe they've become non-responsive. Maybe they have some fourth-party performance issues, or maybe you're seeing some negative news. There's many, many things that could occur during the ongoing monitoring phase of the life cycle. And then at the end, when you're ready to offboard this vendor, maybe they failed to destroy the data and give you a certificate as required through the contract, or maybe the members were so dissatisfied with the service you had no choice but to offboard this vendor, or they had so many operational interruptions that you had no choice. Again, there's a number of things that could occur during the offboarding part of the vendor life cycle that are considered issues worth managing. Who is responsible for managing issues or issue management within your credit union? On the next two slides, we're going to talk about various departments, people, collaborators that are responsible, and I want to point out that these are best practices and recommendations and things we see, but it could be different in your organization. But for one, surely the vendor owner, this is the person that has the responsibility for the relationship, including they're really the one that knows the vendor relationship best. And so they're going to be the one who should be responsible for identification, reporting, and management of any vendor issues. Again, they work most closely with them, and they should be the ones also driving remediation. The business unit, whoever, that vendor owner reports into, the business unit also has responsibility for ensuring that vendor-related issues concerning vendors under their responsibility are also identified. So it could be a different unit. It could be the same unit that the vendor owner is under. So again, multiple people should be looking at this. Then if you have a third-party risk management or vendor risk management team, they should be responsible for documenting these issues and logging what's happening with them, the severity of them, the plans to resolve, and making sure that the vendor owners are accountable for ensuring that the vendors are fixing these. So across this group, everybody has some responsibility. And we'll talk on the next page of some other groups that also have some responsibility. So the prior three groups that I mentioned are the ones who are working actively day to day with the vendor, with the third-party risk management program, should know the the status of all of the vendors and issues that arise. This group this is your management group. This is the group that is your kind of oversight who still needs to be aware and have some responsibility for issue management. So again, management, they're responsible for making sure that the owners are fulfilling their responsibility, the vendor owners and the third-party risk management team that we just mentioned a moment ago. So management makes sure they're doing their job. Internal audit is responsible for ensuring that the issue management processes and protocols are up to snuff, that they're meeting standards, that they're best practices, and that everybody is following them. And then ultimately, the board has the responsibility of ensuring that management and the credit union have these practices in place and are identifying and remediating these issues. So it starts with the person who has the most knowledge of the vendor and works with them all day long and goes up to the board. So managing these issues is definitely an effective part of managing risks within your credit union. We talked about this a couple of times already, but unmanaged issues or issues that, they just keep cropping up can snowball into major problems, increasing that risk for you. Again, back to potentially having financial risk to your organization, reputational risk, those kinds of ultimate risk can occur from these unmanaged issues. And then identifying and understanding the root cause of these issues may help identify new or emerging risks that could be coming. These issues are often a byproduct, and we talked about this already too, of insufficient risk identification and management, whether that's insufficient in your organization or insufficient in the vendor, but it's often a byproduct of that. And the failure to properly manage these issues can result in audit findings or regulatory enforcement actions. Again, the consequences of not following through. And these issues involve critical and high-risk vendors. They absolutely must be reported to the management and to the board, just as we talked about on the previous two slides. They have a part in the responsibility, or they have a responsible part with managing vendor issues. So I've mentioned this a few times too, and the fact that this is a regulatory expectation. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Excuse me. So the thoughts we're going to talk about are from the Interagency Guidance on Third-Party Relationships Risk Management. This is the Federal Reserve, FDIC, and OCC combined guidance. And what I want to do here is to highlight that issues are a topic across the entire life cycle. And again, it's mentioned throughout this guidance, as I mentioned. And if you are a regulated credit union, which I'm sure all of you are, then, I'm sure you've read this, the role that you're in, or somebody that you're reporting to has read this, and understands where these specific issues are touched throughout this guidance. But this is how, this is the crux, really, of why this is important. So one, contract clauses. So the right to audit and require remediation. The contract often, and this is stated in the regulatory guidance, the contract often establishes the banking organizations or the credit union's right to audit, monitor performance, and provide for remediation when issues are identified. So that's something you want to make sure you have in your contracts with these critical and high-risk vendors. Operational resilience and business continuity. Make sure the contract addresses continuity of businesses in case any third-party issues, such as natural disasters, human errors, attacks, etc. It also should outline the third party's responsibility for backing up and protecting your data. So again, these are regulatory guidance telling you how to ensure contractually you're obligating your vendor to be prepared for overcoming, watching for resolving issues that might occur with that vendor. And carrying on this same topic, now this talks about, again, this is in the guidance, third-party risk management roles. And we've mentioned this twice already now, but it specifically states in the guidance that the board of directors are to take appropriate actions to ensure that material issues identified through monitoring or through ongoing monitoring are resolved. So it lands with the board, and management needs to escalate these significant issues to the board. So again, the guidance specifically calls out these two parties and their involvement and responsibility with managing issues with third parties. It also speaks to monitoring, and as part of sound risk management, credit unions should dedicate sufficient staffing with the necessary expertise. I'm reading this one because I think this is important. With the necessary expertise, authority, and accountability to perform ongoing monitoring. And that may include periodic on-site visits. And what that also means is that if you don't have the necessary expertise to perform this ongoing monitoring, this is where you may need to rely on your own third parties, your own outsourcing to make sure that is done appropriately. So again, talking through some specific examples. Say during due diligence, you're discovering that the documentation provided to you by a vendor indicates that they had some failures found during a previous disaster recovery test. Okay, so that's in the due diligence documentation that they provided you. So they had some failures. It could be, you know, a significant concern or a risk if that vendor is critical to you. So it should point out to you an issue that you want to resolve. So this should be an indication to you that you need to follow up with this vendor to ensure that they've either resolved those issues. You may even want to request a new, depending on the severity of that vendor, you may even want to request a new disaster recovery test to see if those failures are still around. So this is an example of how you would find and discover a vendor issue during due diligence. During performance monitoring, maybe again, as you're monitoring this vendor, you're seeing a pattern of declining performance in their service. Maybe they have a slower delivery time, they have more increased downtime, they're just not responsive like they used to be. Again, this type of vendor issue might occur gradually, but it definitely needs to be addressed because it could again lead to bigger problems. Like I mentioned a couple of times already, it could be an indication of maybe a change in management, maybe their operations have just deteriorated. There could be any number of reasons why you're seeing an increase in that. Risk monitoring, maybe during your annual risk review, you've discovered significant deterioration of their financial health possibly. That should definitely be documented as an issue because you want to ensure that that vendor is a going concern and you need to monitor their financial health. And then after termination, maybe you've terminated the contract, but your vendor still has not provided to you a certificate of destruction, which is telling you that they verified that they destroyed all of your data. Or maybe they had a recent data, breach, even post-termination, and you're concerned about that because your data may still be there. That is, again, an example of an issue that would occur at the end of the life cycle with your vendor. On this slide, we're showing you 3 specific examples of what are definitely vendor issues. 1, a cybersecurity breach, 2, unavailable services, or 3, unacceptable member support. Each of these should be identified and documented as an issue. With each of these, you're going to need to work directly with your vendor to understand the impact, to understand their remediation plan, to understand the actions that they're going to take to improve the service level, if it was a service level. And with each of these, you're going to want to do some additional monitoring, maybe more frequent monitoring with this vendor, again, depending on the severity of the issue, but it certainly should indicate to you that there should be more frequency, more contact with this vendor, more oversight with this vendor until there is certainty that these issues have subsided or that they have gotten their hands around whatever processes have allowed these issues to present themselves.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, issue management at my credit union is well developed, somewhat developed, not well developed, or you're not sure. Kelly, we have some time now to answer a question that's come in from the audience. And that question is, when should you begin tracking and monitoring vendor issues?
So tracking and monitoring vendor issues really need to occur from the time you first even thinking about onboarding that vendor or vetting a vendor. Just because there will be things that surface, issues, questions, just items for debate that will surface at all stages through that vendor life cycle from the beginning. So what's most important is that you are tracking these issues and the severity of these issues, because not all issues are, created equal. They will all have different seriousness related to them, but you do want to be able to track them, know what they are, understand which ones the vendor needs to remediate, and therefore you have a tracking mechanism to ensure that that is happening. And again, that you are continuing to monitor the vendor's performance against what your expectations of that vendor is. So there are many ways you might use that information that you are tracking along the way in these vendor issues. For example, you may have quarterly business reviews with the vendor or contract renewal discussions, or maybe you're having pricing discussions, or maybe you're looking at new products, whatever it is you might be doing and discussing with your vendor on an ongoing basis. You should always pull up your tracking of ongoing vendor issues, as they should be a part of any and all of those discussions.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before moving on, in the related content widget, you can find the third-party risk management lifecycle toolkit. As Kelly discussed, where issue management lives in the lifecycle, be sure to grab this toolkit to learn more about the third-party risk management lifecycle stages and steps. Kelly, let's continue with the presentation.
So for the next 5 slides, we're going to talk about the process of managing vendor issues, or having a vendor issue management process in place. And first, you have to develop your process. So you have to know what an issue is. There needs to be some definition around it, probably to include some examples, so that the folks that are managing this process have some clarity into how to actually make it work for them. You need to have developed some kind of rating scale or a system to at least identify the severity of the issues. You need to have some standardized management logs or reporting, so that everybody that is doing this is consistent across the organization. And then the stakeholders across the organization need to be trained on this issue management process, so they understand what it is they're looking at in their role in this process. So all of this needs to, of course, be reflected in your policy and program materials as well. So let's move on to the next step. So then, of course, you're going to be identifying vendor issues, and you need to be able to recognize those issues. And we've talked about many examples already, but again, they're listed here. Again, these are the most common ones, although there could be any number of them. But in this process of identifying the issues, of course, you want to define what scenarios are considered an issue for you, because again, this could be different between you and another credit union. There needs to be some standardized process across your organization, so that anybody who is managing vendor issues are applying the same logic in determining issues and identifying them. And something that's really important as the third step is understanding and determining the severity of the issue, because not all issues will be severe. Hopefully, there will be minimal severe issues. Most of the time, they're going to be issues that you just need to pay attention to and make sure you follow up on. But some examples of some severity metrics is, of course, one being severe, all the way down to just watch. But determining these helps, of course, prioritize these issues and then allocate resources across your organization to work with getting them resolved with the vendor or figuring out what the next steps are if they can't get resolved. And the fourth step in the process is managing the issue. And it's very important to take a collaborative approach here because, again, not one person should probably be overseeing all of the vendor issues. There will be a variety of people involved in this process, as we talked about several slides back. But making sure that those who have some responsibility in this process certainly need to be the ones who are managing the issues. And certain data points that you're going to want to track when you're managing these issues is, of course, the vendor name, what product they're providing, because they could be providing multiple ones. So what product is associated with this service? What is the root cause of the issue? The severity level, of course, when it occurred, what the next steps are, who's responsible, et cetera, et cetera. This is a common way of managing any issues. And then, of course, the last step in the process of managing vendor issues is tracking the issues through remediation. So you're going to want to make sure that there are regular discussions with that vendor and the vendor owner and the collaborators to ensure that everybody on team is informed of the progress. Escalate as needed. Remember, we talked about escalating to management all the way up to the board if necessary, determine action plan, and again, based on the severity, there may need to be an exit plan or at least the testing of an exit plan should it come to that. Okay, so at this point, we are going to take a look at a specific vendor and some scenarios and examples and talk through some issues and the processes around each of those. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I do want to point out that while the process of issue management should definitely be standardized, you have to also recognize that each issue is unique and may require some different approaches to ensure proper remediation. So in vendor issue management scenarios, there is not a one-size-fits-all, basically. So this vendor A is a high-risk vendor. They're in year 2 of a 3-year contract, and they have typically had acceptable performance and have been a reliable vendor. However, during the last quarter, several issues were identified, and there were 4. 1 is they failed to meet some contractual SLAs. 2, they experienced outage during business hours. 3, they had an uptick in member complaints. And 4, they've been slow to respond to your inquiry. So we're going to look at each of these and how the issues for each of them should be addressed. So first is them failing to meet contractual SLA. So on the left side of this, you'll see some vendor owner actions, and on the right side, you'll see third-party or vendor risk management actions. The group that is overseeing that within your organization. But the vendor owner is certainly going to review the contract to make sure that the SLAs and any penalties that might exist to be enacted per the contract. They're going to discuss the situation with the vendor, talk about root cause analysis, remediation plans, talk about timing and getting down to resolution. They're going to document the discussion and all of what they learned from the vendor and definitely share that with the TPRM and the vendor, and set reminders for remediation updates and then update issue management weekly. On the other hand, the third-party or vendor risk management actions, they're going to make sure they understand the severity, identify the severity of the issue, and establish who, other than the vendor owner, should be involved in reviewing and approving the remediation, and set their own reminder, those remediation follow-ups, make sure that gets added to the issue management log and reporting, because this part, the third-party risk management team needs to ensure that this is communicated across the organization. And you're going to see some similar action items across all of these, but this second one is experience an unplanned outage. So again, your vendor owner is going to make sure they're sure through the contract to understand what those uptime requirements are, identify if there were any impacts related to that outage and document them if they are. Discuss it, of course, with the vendor and determine a root cause analysis, talk about what their plans are to make sure it doesn't happen again, document the discussion. Again, I think you're seeing a trend here, similar things that this vendor owner is going to do. And the same thing on the third-party risk management side. They're going to identify the severity of the issue and determine what stakeholders need to be involved. They also need to, work side by side to determine what remediation, if there will be remediation testing, determine who should be around to review and set up reminders for follow-up, and ensure it's logged appropriately and appropriately. The third issue is you're seeing an uptick in customer or member complaints. So you're going to actually review, the vendor owner is going to review those complaints, looking for trends and trouble spots. Review the complaint resolution actions and timing, discuss it with the vendor and request a root cause analysis and plans to resolve. Document those actions and make sure that that information is passed along to the TPRM team. Monitor the performance more frequently, because now that you're seeing a trend with some issues, maybe you are meeting with your vendor quarterly, you should probably do that more frequently, maybe on a monthly basis, or even more frequently than that. The third-party risk management team, again, is going to do the same things they did before: identify the severity, determine who needs to be involved, make sure that the performance monitoring intervals are taking place, determine who will approve remediation, and escalate as necessary. And the final one is the vendor has been slow to respond. These are very, very similar. I don't know that I will necessarily go through them all, because honestly, it is the same process that is going to be done. The vendor owner has some specific actions. The third-party risk management team has their actions. They're both kind of watching out for each other and ensuring that the issue is tracked, managed, and escalated appropriately.
Our second poll question of the day is, at your credit union, how are contracted service level agreements managed? SLA monitoring is a requirement for all critical vendors and is the responsibility of a dedicated person or department. SLA monitoring is done on a few vendors where a responsible party has made that their mission. We have no formal SLA monitoring program or practice in place, or not sure. So we have another question that we could go ahead and answer from the audience. And that question is, what are some common vendor issues? Can you help me understand what an issue is? I think I might be overlooking some things.
Well, that is certainly a good question, and defining what is considered an issue could be unique to each one of you. Some good examples might include maybe you encountered, or the vendor encountered a security issue. You received some kind of notification either from the vendor on that, or maybe some negative news about a security issue with that vendor. Poor vendor communications. This is a really good one that should be considered an issue. If this vendor that you are reliant on, that you have a relationship with, is not communicating, not responsive, not providing you what you need, that should be considered an issue. Maybe they're resistant to providing some required due diligence or other documentation. That is certainly an issue, not meeting those SLAs on that question that we just asked you. If they're not meeting those, that should rise to an issue. Another very common one could be a response to a questionnaire that you send to that vendor. You're just not sure of that answer, so you want to follow up on it. Maybe they're putting some new practice in place, and therefore you want to track the resolution and implementation of that new practice. That could be considered an issue. Again, it's any number of things. So while there is a definition for what is a vendor issue, how you apply that at your credit union could be very different for each of you. But those are some good examples.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before we move on, I would like to remind you that you can find our Managing Issues in Your Third-Party Risk Management Program, the Complete Strategy ebook, and the related content widget. To learn more about managing issues, grab this high-level guide to understand basic strategies. Kelly, back to you.
So while the regulation states that this needs to be done, what it doesn't state is a prescribed process for how these are to be managed and reported on. So it's entirely up to you as to how that is done. But it should be something that is standardized, that is templated, that your organization and all of those parties that are involved in this and that are instrumental to this are a part of. And the documentation is going to create, in the end, an official record of the issue and ensure that all parties are clear on the expectations of remediation and providing some informed updates along the way. And as part of that is an issue remediation plan that should be documented. Again, you found an issue, you're going to talk to the vendor and figure out what, how that issue is going to be resolved and remediated, and you're going to document that throughout this process so that all the stakeholders who need to be involved in this process can monitor it through the end. And in this document, you are going to, gather this necessary information, of course, the vendor information, the product, the issue when it was first identified, what the remediation plan is, what the status of it is, who the affected stakeholders are, who's responsible for approving the remediation, and notes regarding progress along the way. Also related to issue management documentation and your issue management program and process is regular reporting of the issues and the management of those. Again, you need to determine the best reporting format and channel for your credit union. It's going to be different across all of you, but how are you going to report on and review open and unresolved issues versus those that are closed? What report type are you going to use? How are you going to color code them or identify them so that it's quick to identify, especially as that report makes its way up the chain through senior management and into your board. I want to share just a couple of recommendations to help with remediation. One is to keep a conversation and document log. Again, you want to record all conversations that you're having, and they're in one location so that anyone can get access to them that is a stakeholder and has a claim in this process. You certainly want, again, to determine an action plan. What is it? Working with that vendor, you need to ensure these issues are resolved. So what is the action plan, both on the vendor side and on your side, to ensure that it is resolved, whether that is increased monitoring, increased due diligence, maybe some amendments to the contracts, whatever the case may be. There's a couple more we're going to talk about on the next. Continuing on with that, you certainly want to escalate and or terminate as needed. So if the issue can't be resolved, or if the vendor just takes no action to resolve it, then it may come to escalating that as high as the board, and the recommendation be to terminate that relationship. So that is certainly a part or a recommendation with how to resolve with recommendation to help with remediation. And again, report on the issues. So running reports on these vendors that shows the progress and the resolved vendor issues is very important to share that with senior management and the board so that they are aware when vendor problems that have been flagged to them have been resolved, so that they know that things are improving with certain vendors, but then there's those others that, that you're still working on. Having a strong vendor issue management program in place provides increased visibility into your overall risk profile. It provides triggers for exit plans, maybe testing and or implementation, so that you're prepared when things aren't resolved. It provides an opportunity to negotiate better pricing or other contract terms or conditions in the event that there is poor performance or other issues with the vendor. It also provides for improved reporting to the board and other committees and examiners and auditors. It also provides the ability to terminate a vendor relationship due to breach of contract and underlying SLAs specifically. And then it also provides lessons learned as you're working through these issues with vendors and the long-term insight into, recurring vendor problems and how to improve your overall third-party risk management process with all of your vendors. So as I've said, vendor issues are not uncommon, but how can you reduce them? So let's just talk through a few things that might help. First is begin at the earliest stages of the engagement and set those expectations with the vendors that you're going to be monitoring issues, that you have an issue management program in place. Conduct thorough due diligence and remediate any issues that you find during due diligence before you even sign the contract so that you don't start in the hole. Your contract clearly spells out service level agreements, maybe even KPIs and KRIs, and definitely include penalties for substandard performance. And ensure that your contract includes a right to audit clause so that you can be sure that is indeed happening. Continuing on with this, you certainly want to ensure that periodic and ongoing monitoring is done. That is critical to this process, that you have a regular formal risk and performance review with the vendor, maybe on a quarterly basis or however often that might happen. Take any new or emerging risk or performance decline seriously. So don't wait for those small issues to add up and become bigger problems. Address them as they occur. And make sure that you leverage your subject matter experts within your organization, or maybe you outsource those to review and help you with completing remediation or approving remediation plans that are given to you from your vendors. And just a few more. If you do have some vendor issues that are still not remediated, again, increase that monitoring with them, increase your vendor reviews. Don't let up until those issues are remediated. And again, hold the vendor owners accountable because they're the ones that work closest with the vendor and have the greatest responsibility to influence that vendor. And then develop a real relationship with your vendor. I mean, you want to work with the vendor, you want to have a partnership, you want it to be a two-way street. So develop a great relationship with them so that when these issues do arise, there is a great portal between the two of you to ensure resolution. And that will bring us to our final poll question of the day.
Our third and final poll question is, at your credit union, rate your preparedness and program for remediating vendor issues. We have a solid preparedness and actionable program to follow with responsibility outlined. We're getting there. We have some preparedness and program is in place, but we could do better. No preparedness or program, we're not sure. Kelly, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And this one is an issue always an incident?
Not necessarily, because an issue, again, is an event or a situation that is unexpected or undesired. Back to some of those examples I gave earlier about what could be an issue, not all of those would be considered an incident. An incident is typically something severe, like a security incident or a cyber breach or a breach in confidentiality, or downtime is certainly an incident. So incidents certainly take on a more severe level of monitoring. You certainly would be expecting from that vendor things like root cause analysis and documentation to show that it's been resolved and how they expect to present it, and not present it, but prevent it in the future. And they're hopefully uncommon. Issues do not necessarily reach that severity level, thankfully, And issues are really more common. They're, again, just questions that you want to monitor and follow up on. They may be reaching a severity level, but not necessarily all are at the severity level that an incident would certainly be at. So absolutely not, an issue is not always an incident.
And here are those results. Thanks to all for answering this question. Before we continue, I would like to mention again that in the related content widget, you can find 3 ways to measure vendor performance infographic available for download. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Kelly.
So as always, we're going to end with some key takeaways. So develop a process that can be implemented and has some improvement mechanisms along the way. Train your staff and make sure they know what to look for. Update your policy and program files to ensure that issues are taken seriously. Include open issues as part of regular reporting. Use lessons learned from issue management to improve your TPRM process. And refer to historical issues at the time of contract renewals. That's a big one. Don't forget to do that. And then we have one more page of key takeaways. And finally, set expectations with your vendors early in the relationship, even before you sign the contract and get into contract negotiation, that you do have an issue management program in place and you do work and look for and manage issues. Always address open issues with urgency to prevent them from escalating, and follow up on issue remediation even before the due date. Don't wait for something to become past due. Your senior management and board need to be kept aware of open issues, especially concerning high risk and critical vendors. And if all else fails, vendor issues persist, review your exit strategy and plan to ensure a smooth transition if you have to terminate the contract. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jessie.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Kelly for her time and sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On November 19th, How to Identify and Develop Third-Party Risk Management Program Metrics webinar. And on December 3rd, From Data to Action, a practical guide to interpreting and utilizing third-party risk management program metrics webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Kelly, our next question is there a difference between an issue or a concern? It seems some organizations are identifying concerns as those that come out of the due diligence versus issues that arise after the vendor is onboarded. Do you have any thoughts?
I don't, so let me preface this by saying my response is not going to be based on anything I have researched and read or can substantiate with regulation. But when I think about it, I think they're probably the same thing. It's just a matter of what you want to call it. It sounds like in either case, the question is, there is something that has surfaced about a vendor that causes you pause or causes you concern or causes you to have a heightened awareness of following up on it and making sure that whatever the situation is resolved to your satisfaction. So I don't know that it really matters what it's called. I think as long as there is some dedicated effort in a process that is outlined, identified, trained on, followed, adhered to, and put into action, whether you call it an issue or you call it a concern. And it doesn't really matter, again, where it surfaces. It doesn't matter if it surfaces before, while, or after you're working with that vendor. I think they're pretty much all the same. Now, if somebody, again, I'm reminding you, I'm not substantiating that with any evidence because I haven't researched anything. So if anybody on this call certainly believes there is evidence and wants to, negate that, by all means, please feel free to do so. We're all in this to learn together. So I think that would be my response.
Great. Our next question. What are some common reasons or use cases where you would record and monitor an issue with a vendor?
Well, we talked about several of these. I mean, listen, this list could go on, and all of you could have completely different reasons why you might consider something an issue or a concern that you might have with a vendor. But again, just to name a few that are very common and ones that we see with our own vendors and some that we've seen with our own customers that we're supporting. I think a couple of ones that really rise to the top is your vendors not meeting their service level agreements. That certainly should rise to the top as an issue. Maybe a third-party audit, such as a SOC audit report, has an exception notice. That's another, I think, one that would rise to the top. And you certainly, if you're doing your due diligence properly on that vendor, you're reviewing that SOC audit, you see that there is an exception noted, and then you certainly want to follow up with your vendor to find out how they are doing and what they are doing to remediate that exception. Another one certainly would be unexpected downtime. Now, that downtime could eventually, may immediately in your organization, you could have it identified that downtime is automatically an event, and that may be the case versus an issue. Or it may be that it's not an event unless it occurs X number of times within X time period. Again, it would all depend on each one of you. You could each declare that differently. Another really good one that we see often that rises to the top is just a vendor who has become unresponsive. I mean, that indicates all kinds of potential concerns or issues possibly to come. Maybe nothing immediate right now is rising to the top as an issue, other than the fact that you just can't get them to respond to you. And that could lead to something down the road. So you certainly want to see that one as an example. And then one more I'll mention, because we see this all the time, and that is a vendor who has recently had a management change or M&A activity, merger and acquisition activity. That could certainly indicate an issue in your front that you, again, want to monitor and pay closer attention to. So those are some examples. Again, I'm sure there's many, many others, but those are some that rise to the top.
Thanks, Kelly. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thanks again, Kelly, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address with you offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another big thank you to Kelly for her time and content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to vendor issue management. If you would like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in the follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.